Hey guys, I'm Ben and welcome to another episode of Epoch of Greatness. On these shows, we look at a particularly fruitful period for a band, which could be either commercially or artistically, or both. On this episode, we're going to look at the Dutch death metal legends, Pestilence. Pestilence, who formed in 1986 and hailed from the Netherlands, got started as an aggressive thrash metal band before eventually evolving into a death and later progressive death metal band, although even from early on they had progressive tendencies and a flair for writing compelling music with an interesting and unique approach. Their thrash attack is best exemplified early on with the band's first two demos, both from 1987. First you've got Dysentery and Penance, respectively. Both demos are great and loaded with plenty of firepower. The vocal style of main man Patrick Mameli on the first demo was much less gruff and death metal-like than they would later become, and this was also before the excellent vocalist and bass player Martin van Drunen had joined the ranks for the second demo. In 1988, after signing with Roadrunner Records, the band would release their debut album, an album that would be one of the early blueprints for the emerging death thrash approach, the mighty Mallevus Maleficarum.
What's it called? Let's talk about the album.
Well, it's called Mallevus Maleficarum, and it means, in English, it means the witch hammer. It's an old book written in Middle Ages. It's about witches, witch trials, torment of witches. So,
Inquisition.
Inquisition,
Yes.
really, yes.
Good.
Mallevus Maleficarum, while definitely showing signs of the death metal aggression that was to come, still very much was predominantly a thrash metal album, and a killer thrash album it is. Some bands may take an album or two before really being able to execute their sound, and while Pestilence still had some evolving to do creatively, on Mallevus Maleficarum they were already a fully formed, savage beast, boasting memorable songwriting and killer performances, especially from guitarists Patrick Mameli and Randy Meinhard, who provide killer riff after killer riff and fantastic standout lead work peppered throughout the album. Also noteworthy is the wonderfully unhinged vocals of Martin van Drunen, who does a great job fronting the band at this stage. Marco Fotis is also doing a great job laying down the thrash drum attack too. But really, the whole band was firing at full power, and they really showed the metal world straight from the start that they were a force to be reckoned with on this album. Even at this early stage, though, it was clear that the band had the musical talent to diversify successfully, mostly shown only through little hints like the intro to songs like Commandments and the instrumental track Osculum in Flame, which point to the more progressive elements that would bear fruit in a few years' time on later albums. Overall, the band had managed to take the great thrash foundation they had created on the demos and with the new material refine and tighten their writing and delivery, which was now more extreme and harsh vocally, but also more streamlined and impactful. Some of my personal favorite songs include Parasite, Subordinate to the Domination, Chemotherapy, Bacterial Surgery, Commandments, and Cycle of Existence. But really, I think this is a near perfect album. As in, there really are no weak tracks and it's all bangers top to bottom. With Mallevus Maleficarum, Pestilence had thrown down the gauntlet to the European extreme metal scene, and their impact was only going to grow from here. Pestilence would have a change of personnel, with guitarist Randy Meinhardt stepping out and new man Patrick Udovic taking up his place. Then, in 1989, the band would release their next landmark album, the mighty Consuming Impulse.
People were throwing ashtrays, cans of beer, there were bullets on the stage, knives, all kinds of shit. And we were like, fucking hit it. Hit the stage, you know, do the fucking show. And I loved it. I absorbed, when I'm on stage, I absorbed the violence from the crowd. I loved it. That's what makes me even more brutal than normally on stage. That's what I miss so much in the USA. I expected to be every crowd in every town that violent and that aggressive, that brutal, as it was tonight.
If fans from the demo days thought the band had finished upping their game in terms of heaviness and aggression, then Consuming Impulse would have been a shock to the system. Here, Pestilence really begin their death metal journey. While yes, there are very many thrash elements permeating the music, there is also a clear step towards a heavier, more pulverizing sound. The drumming from Marco Fotis has been intensified, and he had started adding some of the death metal elements of double kicks to go with the more malevolent riffing. There are more brooding and dark passages, and even the inclusion of some background keyboards to add some darkness and drama. The vocals from Martin Van Drunen are even more unhinged than they were on Malleus, and they sound amazing throughout. He's really awesome. Like some insane psychopath hopped up on stimulants, waving a knife around in a crowded place or something, just menacing and ferocious. The leads are also leveled up here as well as the overall melodic undertone of each track. One of my favorite things in death metal is when bands are able to convey melody without it being overly obvious or saccharine, especially without it slipping over into melodeath territory. Pestilence are really masters of this, and it's on full display throughout Consuming Impulse. Another thing Pestilence are famous for is being one of the early forefathers of two subgenres of death metal. Alongside bands like Cynic, Atheist, and Death, Pestilence are often credited as paving the way for both progressive death metal as well as technical death metal, with fans from both subgenres looking to Pestilence and this album in particular as one of the earliest progenitors. Of course, this would become far more fully expressed on their next album, but Consuming Impulse certainly has both progressive and technical elements woven into its incredible death thrash attack. Picking standout tracks is really hard because, again, this album is basically perfect and a masterpiece. But if you wanted to get a quick idea of what this album is about, I'd probably check out Out of the Body, fantastic, The Process of Suffocation, and maybe The Trauma. But honestly, you can drop the needle anywhere on this legendary album and it'll be top tier metal. Pestilence would find an international audience with Consuming Impulse, and they would tour internationally with bands like Carcass, Morbid Angel, Celtic Frost, and Bolt Thrower, among others. However, by the time they had finished touring and started working on the next album, vocalist and bass player Martin Van Drunen had departed the band to join another legendary Dutch death metal band, Asphyx. This would lead Patrick Mameli himself to returning to vocal duties and the band bringing in Tony Choi from Cynic to fill the bass role. Consuming Impulse is often vying to be my personal favorite, but it always comes in second because in 1990, with a new studio lineup in tow, the band would release upon the world the masterpiece, Testimony of the Ancients.
The album is like it's not really a concept album, but if you would want to call it a concept album, it's about the quest for the truth of existence. You know, it's about life questions. You know. I mean, is there a God? What am I doing here? You know, what is the the purpose? You know, all that stuff. You know.
So I was lucky enough to see the band perform the entire album live for the anniversary tour of Testimony of the Ancients this year. And hearing those songs in that live setting really further cemented my love for this band and this album especially. Testimony of the Ancients saw the band make a large creative shift forward, a shift that would perhaps annoy some of the old heads who only like death metal pure. However, for many with a more open mind, they realized then, in smaller numbers but more and more over the years, that a masterpiece of metal had been unleashed on the world. Pestilence managed to refine their sound and songwriting approach in several different ways. Ways that on paper would seem to contradict each other, but in reality worked wonders. For example, they managed to both simplify and complicate their riffing, often using very simple, direct, and slower riffs to great effect by juxtaposing them against either more complicated riffing or more epic and lyrical soloing and melodicism. Pestilence would also employ the use of keyboards fairly liberally throughout the album, but as with everything else, it's used to exacting precision and never feels egregious or overused. The songs were now less about just being thrash or death metal attacks and were now extremely well thought out musical progressions that told a story both lyrically but more importantly musically. Coupling this more progressive songwriting approach with the obviously expanding instrumental prowess of the band themselves. And I have to mention Tony Choi's killer percolating bass playing here too. It all makes Testimony of the Ancients to be one of the most compelling albums in metal. Every song has its own unique catchiness and stands out, so picking favorites is virtually impossible for me. But I guess if you were new to this album, you'd have to check out the classics Twisted Truth and Land of Tears, as well as songs like Stigmatized, Prophetic Revelations, and Lost Souls. But this is an all-time favorite of mine, and for me it's a perfect album, so really any of the full songs are a must. I know some people out there bitch about the interlude tracks, but honestly I think this is one of those rare examples when it actually works to give the album even more narrative weight. In short, Testimony of the Ancients is an essential album for fans of progressive death metal, and I highly recommend it to anyone who likes extreme music. Pestilence would grow their audience once again, getting heavy rotation of Land of Tears on MTV, and the band would go out on tour again with Death, while also playing dates with Cannibal Corpse, Napalm Death, Entombed, and Dismember. However, Tony Choi would depart the band, heading back to Florida to eventually join up with fellow prog death contemporaries, Atheist. Filling the bass chair would be the extremely talented Dutch fretless player, Jeroen Paul Fesseling. Fesseling, besides being well known for his time with Pestilence, would later become even more well known for his mind-bending playing with the modern technical death metal masters Obscura, where he is currently once again rejoined to that band. Over the years, Patrick Mameli and some of the other members of Pestilence had shown an ever-growing love and appreciation for other forms of music, especially jazz fusion. Something I can personally relate to in a big way. Anyone who's been watching the channel from the beginning knows that jazz fusion is my other major musical love, along with metal, and has been really since I was a teenager. Anyway, like me, Patrick and crew found themselves feeling the magnetic pull of this form of music, and that would manifest itself in the next studio album, released in May of 1993, the weird and wonderful fourth album, Spheres.
Change already came with testimony. We really saw that things were going in the wrong direction for us. You know, as Marco said, you know, you start to listen to different types of forms of music, and you find out that those people are so much better than you. You know, and that is what is important for us. It's not playing brutal or something, because playing death metal is not really the most, you know, difficult form of music. You know, anybody can play death metal. You know, you see festivals with loads of bands doing that stuff. You know. So, but you can't say that Spheres is a jazz or fusion album or something, or that we wimped out and we're totally jazz or something. We just incorporated, you know, some other styles in that, you know.
So if the old heads were grumbling about the diversions taken on testimony of the ancients, then their grumpy melons must have been positively exploding when they first heard Spheres. Spheres would see the wildest departure for the band to date, taking their progressive tendencies to their ultimate conclusion and crossing over into death metal flavored jazz fusion. Utilizing complex riffing and progressions, the addition of guitar synths to widen the sound palette dramatically, and a willingness to push far beyond the usual confines of death metal into something far more freeform and expansive. They would also border on avant-garde and even experimentalism. All the members shine throughout the album, with special focus, of course, on the fantastic guitar performances, both with the regular guitar sounds and the guitar synth sounds, and the excellent bass work from Thessaling. Personally, I like the drumming. However, it was criticized by some as not being advanced or dynamic enough to keep up with the sheer creativity shown in the composition. It reminds me a little of the dynamic that you had with Swiss thrash legends Coroner, with the drumming being more raw and metallic while the guitars reached further out, which sort of creates an awesome contrast, I think. Here too, the contrast is present, and I feel the drumming helps keep Spheres rooted in the metal world while the rest of the band explores the musical heavens. I've always really liked how that worked in both bands, actually. Spheres, unlike Testimony though, probably never was for the metal masses and never will be. While it has grown a large underground and cult status over the years, at the time it was not overly loved by the fan base, let's say. Even Mameli himself would criticize the album in later years. Personally, I've always loved it, but find it a rare listen. I'm not really sure exactly why either, because every time I play it, I do really love it. I think maybe the production is a bit boxed in sounding at times, and some of the tones can feel a little underwhelming sonically, but really there's nothing dramatically bad there. I'm just sort of nitpicking and looking for a reason, but it's a great album. I think for the majority of fans though, it was just too out there for most people who like their music more formulaic and easier to process. Some of the highlights for me are the driving album opener Mind Reflections, the almost Nocturnus-like Multiple Beings, the dream-like expansiveness of Personal Energy, and the uncomfortable demise of time with its discordant guitar synths and watchtower-like riffs. Again, though, I think the album is great from top to bottom, so really any of the tracks would be a great place to get a feel for the craziness that is Spheres. Spheres is an album for those with an adventurous musical spirit and who aren't afraid to see bands take large creative risks to explore new ground. Fantastic album, and I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, shortly after the release of Spheres, tensions between the band members would become too much to handle, and Pestilence would break up for the first time in 1994, or thereabouts, I believe. I'm not exactly sure. For me, this period of the band, though, through their demos and first 4 albums, marked a truly amazing era for the band and for metal as a whole. Pestilence managed to grow from a fantastic underground thrash band into a progressive, creative juggernaut, artistically speaking, and all within a few years. Patrick Mameli would revive the Pestilence name again multiple times over the years with new lineups in tow, with some previous members occasionally and temporarily rejoining the fold, like bass players Tony Choi and Jeroen Paul Fesseling. Pestilence would release 5 more albums in the following years, all of pretty high quality, but, some better than others, as you would expect. My personal favorite of the latter era stuff is the most recent album, Existium, I think it's called, with its all Latin song titles as well. It's really a fantastic album that I think is a massive return to their peak form. Great stuff. If you haven't heard it, go and check it out. Really good. However, for me, the era that remains most near and dear to my heart is everything up to and including Spheres. And that's why that is, for me, Pestilence's Epoch of Greatness. Anyway, thanks for watching. Stay metal, and see you next time.